In this video, I'll be helping you understand the basics of the respiratory system. And with my current respiratory infection and all the germs that are going around, I thought this was a really excellent way to start, to think about the power that we can generate within our respiratory tract as a response to try to get germs out of our body. And that's just one of the many important functions of the respiratory system. So here we go into chapter 23. The terms that we need to understand here right at the start of the chapter are ventilation and respiration. Ventilation really just means to breathe, right? To bring air in to and out of our lungs. And it doesn't really talk about the gaseous exchange that's happening deep down within our lungs. That's what this term means, external respiration. Internal respiration is what happens when the blood circulates down into the tissues, like your fingers and your liver and your brain. Here we have to exchange the gas from the blood and the tissue fluid. So think about this. I have to take a deep breath in. Oxygen enters my bloodstream, flows down to my toes, where the oxygen leaves the bloodstream and enters the cells. Carbon dioxide then comes out of the cells and into the bloodstream, and then back to the lungs, where I ventilate again to get rid of that CO2. This is the heart of the matter when we think about respiration. If we look just a little bit ahead in our PowerPoint, we're going to see that air comes in through the upper respiratory tract up here. That's mouth and nose, and down to the voice box. And then air continues through ventilation all the way down into every one of these tiny little branches called bronchi. And then the smallest ones are called bronchioles. And at the end of every bronchiole, we find these little grape-like clusters called alveolar sacs. The cluster of grape is an alveolar sac, but the individual grapes are the alveoli, and these are the only part of the respiratory system permeable enough to allow for gaseous exchange. I'll say it again, it's so important. The alveoli are the only part of the respiratory system permeable enough to allow for gaseous exchange. You might recognize that phrase. When we talked about the circulatory system, we learned that the capillaries are the only blood vessels permeable enough to allow for gaseous exchange. And so look at this. Ultimately, your pulmonary arteries going away from the heart take deoxygenated blood right down to the level of the alveolus, where oxygen comes in from the air, turns the blood red. Carbon dioxide comes out of the blood and enters the alveoli. And then we have oxygenated blood going back to the heart, and we have carbon dioxide-rich breath coming out. And in this way, we do external respiration, right? This is the respiratory zone, the only part of this whole system that allows for that. Now, why? Why do we have to get oxygen into our blood? And why do we have to get rid of CO2? Now, I know you would die if you run out of oxygen, but why? What mechanism within your body is actually consuming all of this oxygen and generating all of this carbon dioxide? Let me show you. We can see it here in this idea of aerobic respiration. I don't have high-speed internet, by the way, so it takes a little bit for these images to load. Look at this. Here you are. Oxygen comes into your body to generate ATP, and then you, through your breath, expel a little bit of water vapor and carbon dioxide. Now, where does the oxygen actually get used? It's here, within the mitochondria. This is the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, or we could call it aerobic respiration, or cellular respiration. We'll look at that term in just a little bit, but cellular respiration or aerobic respiration is where we actually use the oxygen to generate ATP. So the whole reason you have to breathe or you will die is because these little crazy tiny worm-like creatures, the mitochondria, use oxygen right here in the Krebs cycle to oxidize the fuels like fatty acids or glucose. You get energy from the food that you eat, but in order to harvest the energy, in order to break down the food you eat at the ultimate level, to harvest energy, to make your body run, you have to do aerobic respiration and you need oxygen. So that's why you have a respiratory system, to bring oxygen into the blood to feed all of these billions and trillions of little mitochondria. And remember, without them, we would die. They make the energy that the rest of our cell runs on. What's the byproduct of this aerobic respiration? Carbon dioxide. And so this is why we have to breathe and why we have a respiratory system. Ultimately, it is all about this gaseous exchange. Okay, going back to our PowerPoint, let's look at a couple of other terms. These are the important functions of the respiratory system. Regulation of blood pH. I'm going to help you understand this in just a few minutes, but the higher the levels of carbon dioxide in your blood, the lower the pH. And it's because carbon dioxide becomes carbonic acid once it encounters water. And so if I stopped breathing, not only would I become hypoxic, right, low oxygen levels in my blood, but I would also become acidotic, right? I would become acidic because of the rising levels of CO2. Production of chemical mediators. This is a pretty minor point, but part of our blood pressure regulation system depends on this enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme. Remember that from the blood chapter? ACE, as in ACE inhibitor, right? That's a function of the lung. Voice production, like we talked about in class. You are a person. You are a being of sound. And my ability to produce speech right now that I can record has to do with my respiratory system. Although it isn't working quite as well as usual, I guess I kind of have my radio announcer voice. This bronchitis and all the inflammation in my larynx has definitely lowered the frequency of my voice. So it's the vocal folds that actually make sound and speech. You might remember we had looked at that video of Steven Tyler from Aerosmith in the endoscopy showing his vocal cords in action. If you missed it, you could go to our Blackboard page right now, and in the Chapter 23 lecture folder, there's a video at the bottom called National Geographic, The Amazing Human Machine, I think it's called. Olfaction means sense of smell, and of course protection against microorganisms. Our respiratory tract is one of the most vulnerable parts of our body in terms of allowing germs to set up shop. And for obvious reasons, right? I breathe in and out way more often than I swallow, or the portals of entry. It's a phrase we use to talk about the nostrils and the oral cavity. Look at this. Every time you breathe in, and every time you take a deep breath right before you talk, you're just sucking in germs. And so we need this upper respiratory tract to be full of immunological fighters. It's really what the tonsils are. So looking at this picture here, we see we have an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. And really the dividing line is the opening between the vocal cords, the glottis. The glottis, which makes sense if you know this is called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is this flap of cartilage that comes down over the top of the trachea when we swallow. And it's called the epiglottis because it's above the opening, the glottis. Lower respiratory tract is everything below the glottis, including trachea, bronchi, the bronchioles, these smaller tubes that we see here, this picture right here, right, lower respiratory tract, below the glottis, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and then ultimately the alveolar sacs and the alveoli. That's all lower respiratory tract. Okay, moving really quickly through this section because we really covered this pretty well in lab. Remember, there are a couple of other openings other than the nostrils and the oral cavity. We have two openings, one on each side, the eustachian tube, which your book calls auditory tube. I don't think that's the best name for it. I'd call it the pharyngotympanic tube, to be really specific, because it's going from the throat, or pharynx, up into the middle ear cavity. Here's the larynx down below. The pharynx is divided into 3 different regions: the nose throat, the mouth throat, and the voice box throat. That's nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Air then sort of makes a little angle and then heads down, sucking down into the trachea, or through pressure, rising and coming up when we breathe in and out. What's this thing back here? The esophagus, which is shown in an open position right now. It's a little bit artificial. Right here at the back, there's an upper esophageal sphincter. It's actually closed except for the times when we swallow or burp or vomit, I suppose. But right now it's shown open, so this is a bit of an unnatural arrangement. Let's see, what else can we talk about here? We pretty well covered all of this in lab. And I strongly encourage you to revisit those videos of the endoscopy showing the anatomy of the vocal cords and how the shape of the instrument changes with our voice. And then that Steven Tyler one's pretty cool just because he's like a grandpa and he totally still rocks. The mucociliary escalator is the next interesting point. Look at this. The lumen of the trachea is right next to the lumen of the esophagus. And if we look at a histological slide, we can see that the rings of cartilage surrounding the trachea are horseshoe-shaped, but they don't go all the way around. And so we have this so-called trachealis muscle right here. When we swallow, the esophagus gets much larger to accommodate that bolus of food. And so we evolved a compact area where when we breathe, this is respiratory area. When we swallow, these 2 lines flex a little bit. And so the esophagus can occupy more space during that wave of peristalsis. Okay, here we go. The mucociliary escalator is the lining of the bronchi and the trachea and right up into the larynx. This is made of this ciliated epithelium. It's actually called ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And interspersed within that epithelium are goblet cells. Goblet cells produce mucus. And so this is really gross, but it's super important. We have a slow motion upside down river of mucus slowly moving up and out of our lungs. Like so many tiny rock stars, the cilia are body passing these little particles of dust and germs and mucus and pushing it up against gravity. Up, 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 until it reaches the glottis. And then we have a bit of a sensation, a coughing reflex. And then we swallow it. Oh, that's so gross. But it is a great design. We have a self-cleaning duct here. And where do we dump those nasty things and germs? Right down into the highly acidic environment of the stomach. So we can kill the germs and keep our lungs clean all at the same time. The mucociliary escalator. How about that? As a very quick aside, we know that the chemicals of cigarette smoke paralyze these cilia for something like 30 to 40 minutes. And so for chain smokers or people who are smoking a couple packs a day, these cilia are paralyzed the entire day. And so patients who smoke cigarettes, and it's a dose-dependent relationship, the more you smoke, the more potential damage there can be. We could imagine that mucociliary escalator grinds to a halt, and so germs and cancer-causing chemicals and dust and anything else that you might be breathing in, it just sits there in the lungs. And that's probably the most direct connection between chronic bronchitis and pneumonia and smoking. Okay, that just about does it for the first video. When we come back, I'll be talking a little bit more about respiration.